There are nights when I sit by the window and listen to the city breathing, and I think about how ordinary everything sounds. The distant creak of a cart somewhere in the lower quarter, a dog somewhere across the rooftops, announcing something to no one in particular. The soft, barely perceptible press of wind against stone that has been standing for so long it has ceased to be aware of the wind and simply endures it, as it has endured everything, with the patient indifference of things that do not have the burden of memory. And I think, sitting there in the particular quality of late evening stillness that settles over this city when the last of the working day has finally concluded and the streets have given themselves back to quieter purposes, I think that it sounded exactly like this before. Before all of it. Before any of it. The world makes the same sounds whether it is whole or broken, whether its streets are full or emptied, whether the people moving through it are living in the before or the after of something that changed everything. The world goes on making its sounds, and I have had many years now to sit with that strange and not entirely comfortless fact. I am old. My hands know it before the rest of me does in the mornings. The stiffness that arrives before I am fully awake, the reluctance of knuckles that have ground more herbs than I could ever accurately count, that have rolled more bandages and stirred more preparations and sorted more dried bundles than the years themselves can properly contain. My back has developed, over the last decade or so, a set of considered opinions about cold weather that it did not hold when I was young. My eyes require assistance for reading, and have for some years, and I have made a peace with this that is not entirely enthusiastic, but is genuine enough to be functional. But my memory is intact. This, my son tells me with a fondness he tries to make sound like simple observation, is a gift. I have wondered, over the years and with increasing frequency as the years have accumulated, whether gift is always, and without qualification the right word for it. A sharp memory, in a man who has lived through what I have lived through, is not only an asset. It is also the instrument by which the past makes its recurring visits, arriving at unexpected hours, at the smell of a particular herb, at the sound of cart wheels on stone, at the quality of light in late afternoon on an autumn day, with the particular vividness of things that were once real and present and inhabited and are now entirely irretrievable except in this way. Through this interior door that the memory keeps unlocked regardless of whether you have decided you want it open. I have been an apothecary for most of my life, and I will be one, I think, until the very end of it. It is the only identity that survived the years I am going to tell you about entirely intact, without revision or fracture or the need for the kind of careful reconstruction that follows a significant damage. Everything else that I was, husband, neighbor, professional confident in the sufficiency of his training, citizen of a world that arranged itself according to a comprehensible logic, all of that was remade in the years I am going to describe, or lost, or changed into something so different from what it had been that I can barely trace, even now, the line back to where it started. But the apothecary remains. The herbs remain. The mortar and the shelves and the jars, and the pale morning light coming through the shutters when I open them, and the shop fills slowly, filling the way rooms fill with light rather than the way they fill with water, gradually, from the top, golden rather than flooding. These remain. And I am grateful for them in a way that has only deepened with the accumulation of years and the corresponding accumulation of understanding about how much can be taken and how little, ultimately, is guaranteed to stay. I want to tell you what it was like. I want to say this clearly at the outset and hold to it, because accounts of the kind I am giving you have a tendency to drift toward other purposes, toward instruction, toward warning, toward the desire to demonstrate that suffering produces wisdom, which is sometimes true and sometimes simply the way survivors justify to themselves the fact of their survival. I do not want to justify my survival. I survived by a combination of choices and circumstances and what I can only call fortune, and the fortune portion of that combination was large enough that modesty requires I acknowledge it plainly. I want to tell you what it was like because I was there, and because the record of what it was like to be a particular person in a particular place while particular things were happening seems to me to have a value that exists independently of whether that person was admirable or prescient or anything other than present and attentive. I was present. I paid as much attention as I was capable of paying. This is what I have to offer. I was 37 years old in the autumn of 1346. I know this precisely because September of that year marked my birthday, and I had observed it with a small supper in the way I had observed it for the preceding decade or more, my wife, my 2 children, my apprentice Henri, and the baker from across the lane whose name was Pierre and who had been my neighbor for so long that his presence at any gathering of consequence felt simply natural. The way the presence of familiar furniture feels natural, something you would notice only by its absence. We ate bread that Pierre had made. Excellent bread. This was not a small thing about Pierre. His bread was genuinely excellent, and I ate it every morning of the years we were neighbors and never once took it for granted and still occasionally dream about the specific smell of it warm from the oven on a cold morning. And a roasted bird and wine that was adequate rather than remarkable, but which was ours, purchased from a merchant I knew for the specific purpose of the evening. My daughter fell asleep at the table, as she had been doing since she was very small, her head resting on her folded arms with the complete and trusting surrender to sleep that belongs to children who have not yet had reason to consider whether the place they are is safe. My son argued with Henri about something that evaporated entirely from both their memories by morning, as the arguments of young men so often do, conducted with great conviction about stakes that prove, by daylight, to have been largely imaginary. My wife and I sat together afterward, in the way we had been sitting together after evenings for a dozen years, close enough that conversation was easy, quiet enough that silence was also easy, in the particular companionable warmth that a long and genuinely affectionate partnership generates between two people who have had the patience and the luck to grow into rather than out of each other. We did not discuss anything remarkable. The fire settled into coals. The children were put to bed. Henri went back to his room above the shop. Pierre returned across the lane to his own household. And the evening closed around us in the ordinary way that evenings close, without fanfare, without significance, without any indication that it was anything other than what it appeared to be. One unremarkable evening in an unremarkable sequence of evenings that stretched in both directions, backward through all the evenings we had already lived and forward through all the evenings we had every reason to expect. I want you to sit with that image for a moment before I go further. The shop across the lane with its shutters closed. The fire settling. My wife's voice, quiet and familiar. The smell of the wine and the bread and the particular warm interior smell of a house that has been well lived in. That compound of wood smoke and cooking and human habitation and the faint underlying sweetness of the dried herbs that drifted from the shop through the connecting door. I want you to sit with it because everything that comes after is incomprehensible without it, and because it deserves to be fully inhabited before it is lost, and because I have learned, at a cost I would not choose for anyone and cannot entirely make sense of even now, that the ordinary moment, the unremarkable evening, the adequately good wine and the excellent bread and the familiar voice and the fire settling into coals. These are the substance of a life, not its backdrop. They are not what life is made of between the important events. They are what life is made of, full stop. And the sooner a person understands this, the better, though most of us, myself very much included, requires something catastrophic to teach us what should have been obvious all along. My shop stood near the edge of the market square, close enough to the daily life of the city's commerce that the mornings had a quality of energetic noise about them. The vendors setting up in the dark before dawn, the specific rattling and calling of a market coming to life, the livestock that passed through twice weekly on their way to and from the animal market at the far end of the square, the apprentices and servants of other establishments crossing the square on their errands with the purposeful half-trot of people who have been told to be quick about it, far enough from the center that the afternoon crowds did not press against my door or make the shop feel like an extension of the public thoroughfare. It was a good location. My teacher had understood the importance of the location when he chose it, and his teacher before him had presumably understood it as well, and the 3 generations of understanding had accumulated into a space that worked, that had the right relationship to the life of the city around it without being overwhelmed by it. I had inherited the space from my teacher, who had been given it by his, and the walls held the accumulated smell of every herb that had ever been dried and sorted and dispensed within them across 3 generations of practice. Rosemary, lavender. The dry, slightly bitter smell of wormwood, which has a sharpness that cuts through everything else and announces itself before you have properly identified it. Dried valerian root with its complex and not entirely pleasant, but somehow comforting earthiness. Chamomile kept in its clay jar on the second shelf from the top. The jar I had placed there myself when I first reorganized the shop after my teacher's death. and which had been in that spot ever since, the clay slightly cool to the touch even in summer. I knew every jar and every bundle and every corner of that room in the way that you know the rooms of a house you have lived in for many years, not by actively perceiving them, but by a kind of absorbed familiarity that has incorporated them so thoroughly into the architecture of ordinary experience that they have ceased to require attention and have become simply part of the texture of being. I moved through those rooms without looking at them most days. My hands found what they needed before my conscious mind had finished formulating the intention to find it. The space was an extension of myself, or I was an extension of it. The distinction becomes unclear when the habitation is long enough and intimate enough. What I know is that it fit me, or I fit it, and that this fitting was one of the small and unnoticed satisfactions of my daily existence. The kind of satisfaction that registers only as a mild, continuous contentment rather than as specific pleasure, and that you discover the true magnitude of only when you imagine its absence, or when the absence is forced upon you. Montpellier was, in those years, one of the most learned cities in Europe, or at least we believe this about ourselves with the comfortable confidence that long-established institutions generate in the people associated with them. The university's School of Medicine had been in operation for more than a century. Founded before any living person had been born, its existence predating the personal histories of everyone who moved within its orbit, which lends an institution a quality of naturalness, of self-evidence, of having always been and therefore always being appropriate to continue. Physicians came from across the continent and from the Mediterranean world to study there. Arabic scholarship had been flowing into the European medical tradition through Montpellier and similar centers for generations, enriching the Galenic framework with observations and refinements that had traveled north and west from the great centers of Islamic learning, and I had been trained in this tradition and found it genuinely admirable. An accumulated body of careful thought about the human body and its ailments, built by serious people over many centuries, organized into a coherent and internally consistent system that addressed itself to the full range of what medicine encountered. I was not a physician. The distinction was important socially and professionally, though in practice the boundary between what an apothecary did and what a physician did was sometimes more porous than official categories implied. Apothecaries made the medicines. We knew the materials, knew them at the level of the hand and the nose and the tongue, knew which combinations produced which effects and which combinations produced unintended or dangerous effects, knew the proportions and the preparations and the qualities of fresh versus dried and the specific differences between materials sourced from different regions. We dealt directly with patients in ways that physicians, consulting formally in their professional chambers, sometimes did not. We were practical, in the fullest sense of that word, and I had been trained by a physician, which meant that I had access to the theoretical framework as well as the practical one, and thought of myself as someone who operated across both registers. This framework, the whole edifice of humoral theory, of disease as imbalance, of treatment as the restoration of balance through the specific interventions available, was not something I held at arm's length as a useful professional tool while privately remaining skeptical of its foundations. I held it the way you hold a belief that has been confirmed by sufficient experience over sufficient time that it has ceased to feel like a belief and has become simply the way things are. I had used it to help people. I had watched it work in the qualified way that medicine works. Not always, not infallibly, but often enough and reliably enough that the framework seemed to me to be in genuine correspondence with reality. The deaths I could not prevent I understood as the limits of medicine applied to conditions beyond medicine's reach, the limits of my own skill, the severity of particular cases, the complications that no intervention could address. I did not understand them as evidence against the framework itself, because the framework had sufficient flexibility to absorb individual failures without requiring fundamental revision. I trusted it entirely. This is the most important thing I can tell you about who I was in the autumn of 1346, because I cannot explain who I became without first making completely clear who I was. And who I was a man who trusted his framework entirely. Not because I was simple or incurious or insufficiently attentive to evidence. Because I was a trained professional who had spent 20 years practicing within a tradition that had demonstrable successes to its credit, working in a city that was one of that tradition's acknowledged centers, surrounded by colleagues who shared my orientation, embedded in an intellectual community that reinforced the framework daily. I was, in other words, a man doing exactly what it is reasonable for a man in my position to do. I was being the professional I had been formed to be. And the professional I had been formed to be was entirely unprepared for what was coming. The market square in the mornings had a smell that was the composite of everything that happened there. The bread, always and first the bread, baking in Pierre's ovens from before dawn and releasing that specific warm grain-in-crust fragrance that is among the more benevolent smells a human being can encounter on a cold morning. The animals that passed through, which contributed something less benevolent, but which was simply part of the olfactory texture of a working city, inseparable from the rest. The spices and dried goods from the stalls that served the households of the more prosperous citizens, which brought particular scents from the east and the south. Pepper and ginger, and the more exotic things I handled in smaller quantities in the shop. Wood smoke from a dozen fires. River water on a wet day, that slightly mineral freshness drifting up from the direction of the waterway. And through all of it, woven through it like a thread, the faint medicinal undertone of my own shop, which I carried with me and could identify, whenever I returned to it after absence, as home. I moved through the square with the practiced ease of someone who has learned the specific choreography of a particular place, knowing which routes were fastest at which hours, knowing which vendors were inclined to conversation and which preferred efficiency, knowing the specific moods and patterns of the market as a whole, which varied by season and weather and the particular quality of the commercial season. I had lived in this city for most of my adult life. I knew it, in the way that long habitation produces knowing, not encyclopedically, not with the comprehensive knowledge of someone who has studied it from outside, but intimately, in the specific and partial and deeply personal way that comes from having moved through a place for years, having watched its changes and its continuities, having oriented your own life within it until the city and the life have become, at least in the daily working sense, inseparable. I attended Mass each morning at the cathedral before opening the shop. This was not a formal or deliberate spiritual discipline so much as it was the structure that organized the beginning of every day, the thing that happened between waking and working, the space between the private and the public that the morning required. I had been doing it since I was a student, and my father had done it before me. And the practice had the character of things that have been absorbed so early and continued so long that discontinuing them would feel not like freedom, but like a structural failure, like removing a wall that had been holding something up without your being aware that it was doing so. There was a sequence to the mornings that I had performed so many thousands of times that it had become, in the truest sense, unconscious. Not in the sense of being careless or inattentive, but in the sense of having been absorbed so deeply into the body's habitual knowledge that it no longer required the management of the conscious mind to execute. I woke before the bells for lauds, in the particular darkness that precedes the first quality of pre-dawn light, and lay for a few minutes in the warmth of the bed listening to the city in its deepest quiet, the hour between the night's last business and the morning's first. My wife breathed beside me with the slow evenness of a person fully asleep, and I would sometimes lie listening to this, to her breathing, to the occasional distant sound from the streets, to the quality of silence in our house, and feel, without naming it, a satisfaction so complete and so ordinary that it asked nothing of me except the willingness to remain where I was and let it be what it was. Then I rose. The sequence that followed was not thought about. The specific order of dressing, the water for my face from the basin that Henri had learned to fill the night before without being reminded, the outer garments taken from their places with the slight additional care that cold mornings required, the walk down the stairs through the still dark shop, where the herbs smelled strongest in the morning cold, the door opening into the street. The air outside was always a kind of small shock, however many thousands of times I had stepped into it. The specific temperature and quality of the outdoor air against skin that has been warm under blankets always announces itself, always registers as a distinct change in the state of things, as a small re-entry into the public world. I walked to the cathedral through streets that were mostly empty, but not quite empty. The bakers were always up, and occasionally a night soil cart, and the occasional figure moving quickly with the purposeful quality of someone who has somewhere specific to be at an early hour. The distance was short enough that the walk itself was barely a walk, more an extension of the threshold between the private and the public that the morning required me to cross. I stood beside a particular column in the nave. near enough to the left side that I had a clear view of the altar and far enough from the main entrance that the small disturbances of late arrivals did not reach me. The column had a faint discoloration at shoulder height, a mark I had stood beside for nearly 20 years without ever learning its origin, studying it with the mild, unfocused attention that the mind gives to familiar things it has never quite decided what to do with. The incense smell was constant, embedded in the stone after centuries of use, present even on the days when no incense was burning. The acoustics of the nave delivered the priest's voice to my corner with a slight resonance that felt, in the way that acoustic peculiarities of familiar spaces feel, personal, as if the building had arranged itself to serve my specific attendance. These details, the column, the smell, the acoustics, the square, the bread, the mortar in its place, my wife's voice in the evenings, my daughter asleep at the table. I am giving you these details because they are what I carry. They are the specific material of the world I inhabited before, and they are the material against which everything that came after is measured. Not nostalgically, not with the distorting tendency of memory to smooth what was difficult and amplify what was pleasant. Honestly, the world before was a world with its own difficulties and its own limitations and its own small cruelties, and I do not want to present it as a paradise interrupted. But it was a world, a functioning, inhabited, ordinary world, with all the specific texture that ordinary worlds accumulate when they have been in continuous operation for long enough. And what happened to it was not ordinary. And the comparison between what it was and what it became is the thing I have been trying, across many years, to properly articulate. There were rumors. There are always rumors in a city like Montpellier, a trading city, a city of movement and commerce and the constant flow of people through its gates and along its streets. Rumors arrive with the merchants and the sailors and the pilgrims and the refugees and everyone else who passes through, and they enter the general circulation of the city's conversation and travel and transform as they travel, each retelling adding something, removing something, inflecting the facts with the particular fears and emphases of the particular teller. I had developed, over years of professional practice, a trained skepticism about rumors, a habit of treating second-hand and third-hand accounts with the suspension of judgment that accurate assessment requires. I heard, sometime in late autumn of 1346, that there was a sickness moving through the Crimea and the ports of the Black Sea, something connected to the Mongol trade routes, something the Genoese merchants stationed at the port of Kaffa had encountered in their trading outpost, and from which they had eventually fled, abandoning their position and sailing west with what cargo and personnel they could manage. I heard this in the shop from a merchant who traded me Eastern spices and who was the kind of man who collected news the way he collected goods, from everywhere, in quantity, without necessarily distinguishing the valuable from the worthless. He mentioned it in passing, as one item among many, and I received it as one item among many, filed it in the general category of distant troubles that periodically agitated the margins of European commerce without necessarily affecting its center, and returned to the work I had been doing when he arrived. I mention this because it was the first time the information was available to me, and because I have thought many times about what a different quality of attention or a different framework of understanding might have made of it. I do not, even now, believe that I could have understood it correctly. The information itself was insufficient for correct understanding even if the mind receiving it had been entirely free of the assumptions that mind carried. But I have thought about it anyway. The way the mind returns repeatedly to moments of threshold crossing, trying to find in the retrospective examination some understanding that the prospective version lacked. The winter passed as winters pass in southern France, cold enough to drive commerce indoors and thin the foot traffic in the market, warm enough that the worst of what northern travelers described in their accounts of continental winters was absent, a winter that required endurance but not heroism. Henry's chest ailment kept him in bed for 2 weeks in January, during which I managed the shop alone and discovered, with some surprise, how much of the daily work he had absorbed in the years of his apprenticeship. He was not a brilliant young man in any obvious sense, not quick with theoretical argument, not particularly interested in the scholarly side of the practice, but he was steady and careful and genuinely attentive to the specific needs of specific patients, and his absence from the shop revealed the value of those qualities more clearly than his presence had. He recovered entirely, returning looking thinner and somehow clarified, as if the fever had burned something away and left what remained in sharper focus. My children were well. My wife was well. The practice was busy with the ordinary ailments of winter. The cathedral was the same. The column was the same. The mornings were cold and the shop was warm and the bread from across the lane was excellent, as it had always been, as I had no reason to expect it would not always continue to be. Spring came in 1347 with the particular quality of relief that spring carries in places where the winter is genuinely cold. Not the dramatic relief of regions where the winter is brutal, but the quieter relief of a return to a more comfortable register, the world resuming its full range of temperatures and smells and outdoor life after the contracted indoor months. The market filled. The roads reopened to easier travel. The merchants who had wintered in one place began to move again, and with their movement came the goods and the information and the rumors that trade routes carry alongside their primary cargo. The first accounts from the coast reached me in spring. They were confused. This is the thing I want to convey about those early weeks of rumor. Not that the information was absent, because the information was present, arriving from multiple sources in quantities that should perhaps have been alarming. The problem was that the information was too inconsistent, too internally contradictory, too dependent on the quality of frightened and often poorly positioned observers to assemble into anything that could be properly assessed. I heard accounts of a fever. I heard accounts of something quite different from a fever. I heard about swellings, about deaths that happened very quickly, about illness progressing with a speed that the normal frameworks of fever and contagion did not accommodate. And I heard also accounts that contradicted these, from people who had been in Marseille more recently or who had spoken to people who had, and whose descriptions were less dramatic. I did what I was trained to do with inconsistent information. I noted it, I suspended judgment, and I waited for something more reliable. This is, in most circumstances, the correct response to inconsistent secondhand accounts. In this circumstance, it was the response that the situation was designed, by its nature, to elicit, a nature that I did not yet understand. The first patient. I need to tell you about the first patient I saw who had what I now know to have been plague, because seeing him was the moment the situation moved from abstract concern to concrete presence in my working life, and because the specific qualities of what I encountered that afternoon in the river quarter are the things against which every subsequent development was measured. He was a dock worker, a large man in his mid-40s with the physical substance of a man who has done demanding physical work for most of his adult life. The kind of man whose body looks like an argument against the possibility of serious illness, whose sheer physical presence seems to render him implausible as a patient. His wife had sent for me with a message that conveyed urgency, without conveying the specific nature of what I was being summoned to, which meant I arrived without the particular preparation that knowing would have required. He had a fever. I say this simply, but I want you to understand that the fever I am describing was not of the ordinary type. Not the elevated temperature that accompanies the illnesses I treated routinely, the chest ailments and the digestive fevers, and the seasonal complaints that a physician or apothecary manages as the standard work of the profession. This was something qualitatively different, a fever that seemed to have reorganized the body around itself. That was not an episode occurring within normal function, but a replacement of normal function with something entirely other. He was delirious, his speech disconnected from any apparent referent in the room, his eyes moving with the unsettled quality of a person perceiving a reality that has no correspondence to the one his wife and I occupied. And at his neck, and at his armpit when I examined further, there were the swellings, hard and dark-edged, and carrying a heat of their own, visible to the eye and available to the touch in a way that communicated wrongness before any analytical process had been completed. I examined him with the thoroughness I had been trained to bring to every examination, asking the questions in the sequence I had been taught to ask them, noting the answers with the systematic attention that my training required. I said what I was trained to say to a frightened family. I prescribed what my training indicated, and I walked home through the river quarter in the early afternoon light, past the houses and the narrow streets that I knew from years of professional calls in this part of the city, with a sensation in my chest and hands that I did not immediately have words for, a sensation that I have since come to understand as the body's recognition, prior to the mind's formal acknowledgement, that something lies outside the range of the frameworks available. The physician Arnaud had been called to the same patient. When I visited him the following morning, The careful uncertainty in his expression confirmed what I had felt in mine. We talked for a long time, in the measured language that trained professionals use when they are being honest with each other about the limits of their knowledge. A more useful language than the confident language of formal consultation, but one that required the trust of a private conversation to deploy. We referenced our texts. We proposed and rejected interpretations. We arrived at no conclusion, which was itself a kind of conclusion, and we agreed to continue observing and to compare what we found. There were more cases within a week. In the river quarter first, then spreading from there with a directionality that was visible to anyone paying close attention. From the areas of densest contact with the port, with the movement of goods and people, outward into the body of the city along the routes of daily commerce and connection. The market changed. Not dramatically. There was no single day on which the change became obvious. It happened in increments, each small enough to accommodate within the existing sense of normality, the cumulative effect only becoming fully visible when I tried to compare the market as it was in July to the market as it had been in April. There was a particular afternoon in June, the air warm enough that the shop doors stood open, the market at its midday fullness, when I stood at my counter preparing a common preparation for a patient whose ailment was the ordinary kind of ailment that June brought, and I became aware that something in my peripheral vision had changed. The street outside the open door had fewer people in it than it should have had at that hour. Not dramatically fewer, not the absence that would later become characteristic of those streets, but fewer. And the people who were present were moving with a quality that was subtly different from the midday movement I had watched from that doorway for 20 years, a quality of reservation, of a slight increase in the space each person maintained around themselves, of bodies that were navigating through the public space with a small additional intentionality that ordinary midday movement does not require. I noticed this in the way you notice things that have not yet risen to the level of conscious concern, as a background irregularity that registers without yet becoming an object of explicit attention. I returned to the preparation. I gave the patient his remedy. I recorded the consultation in my ledger. And the irregularity settled somewhere in the back of my awareness, alongside the other things I had noted and not yet fully processed, accumulating. The university physicians convened formally. Arnaud attended and reported back, and what he reported was something I have thought about with increasing clarity across all the years since. The meeting had been dominated, he said, by the requirement to produce a formal position, an official account that could be circulated, that would represent the institution's considered response, that would do what institutions require their responses to do, which is to be stated with authority and to suggest that the situation is within the range of understood phenomena and addressable through available means. The physicians who said they did not know were heard with the pained attention that institutions give to inconvenient honesty and then set aside. I understood, hearing this, something about institutions that I had not previously needed to understand. Institutions are not primarily truth-seeking mechanisms, though they often contain, within them, truth-seeking people. They are primarily self-maintaining mechanisms. The primary function of an institution, at the level of its deepest operation, is to continue being the institution it is, to preserve its coherence, its authority, its established ways of doing what it does. Truth-seeking can coexist with this function, can even be part of it, but when the two conflict, the institutional self-preservation tends to prevail. The physicians in that meeting room were not lying, were not cynically suppressing better knowledge for political advantage. They were doing what institutions do, reaching for the account that preserves the institution's authority over the situation, even when the situation had moved beyond the authority's reach. I was doing versions of the same thing myself. My remedies continued. My records continued. My consultations continued. Not because I had stopped being aware that my framework was strained. I was aware, with increasing clarity, that the illness I was encountering did not fit the framework in ways I could not resolve by adjustment. But the act of continuing the practice, of continuing to be an apothecary with an apothecary's tools and an apothecary's procedures, was the act of continuing to be a person with a coherent identity and a coherent role, and I was not yet ready to be a person without those things. This is a form of self-deception, and I knew it was a form of self-deception even at the time, and I continued anyway, because the alternative, to stand fully in what I actually knew and did not know, without the protective coloration of professional routine, was more frightening than the illness itself. My wife's response was different, and I want to give it its proper weight because it has stayed with me as one of the most instructive things I witnessed in those years. She was not trained in medicine. She had no theoretical framework, no organized system of thought about disease and its causes and its treatments. She had her own intelligence, which was of a distinctly practical kind, the intelligence that operates by direct observation and clear-headed inference, without the intermediate step of matching observations to an established model. She had been listening. In the market, at the well, in the conversations women have in the spaces where women gather to exchange information about the households and the streets and the neighborhood. She had been assembling, from these conversations, a picture of how the illness moved. And what she had concluded, without theory, without training, without any credential that the university would have recognized, was that it moved through contact. That the people who became ill had mostly been in contact with people who were already ill, in ways that could be traced if you paid attention to the sequences. She acted on this conclusion. She moved the children into the back room. She changed the arrangements for Henry's meals. She asked me to wash and change when I returned from certain consultations. She did this without argument, without explanation that went beyond the practical, without any claim to theoretical authority she did not possess. She had watched and inferred and acted, and the action was, as nearly as I have been able to determine across all the years of subsequent reflection, considerably more accurate than the formal response of the learned institution a short distance from my door. I felt, as I have said, two things simultaneously when she began these practices. The gratitude was real, a genuine recognition of her intelligence and her care and the specific quality of her love, which expressed itself in this precise and practical way rather than in more demonstrative forms. And the resistance was also real. I am not going to soften it by attributing it entirely to professional defensiveness or to the general tendency of learned men to undervalue practical intelligence. It was partly those things. It was also the resistance of someone whose framework of understanding was being quietly but unmistakably challenged by someone who had arrived at better conclusions without the framework he had spent 20 years developing. This is not a comfortable experience. I absorbed it as well as I was able, which was imperfectly, and I began washing my hands with more thoroughness than I had previously considered necessary, without formally acknowledging to myself the implication of doing so. The summer deepened. The market thinned. The wealthier households in the upper quarter began, one by one, and then more visibly, to close and vacate. The shuttered windows appearing first as individual instances and then accumulating into a pattern that could not be explained away as coincidence or seasonal travel. I watched this from the door of the shop on certain afternoons, watching the people moving toward the gates with the specific pace of people who are not sure they are moving quickly enough, and I turned the question of my own staying and going over in my mind with a frequency that was not productive but that I could not prevent. I have already told you why I stayed. I want to return to it and expand it slightly, because the experience of staying, of being one of the people who remained in a city that was actively emptying, produced a set of perceptions about the people around me that I think are worth describing. The people who stayed were various, as I have said, but there was something in the act of staying, whatever its cause, that produced a specific kind of bond among those who stayed, a recognition, not always spoken but continuously present, that we shared a situation that was separating us from those who had left and from anyone who had not been present. This bond was not chosen. It was not built on affection or prior relationship or shared values in any conventional sense. It was simply the bond of shared exposure, of having been in the same place while the same things were happening, and having therefore been changed by those things in ways that would be difficult or impossible to fully communicate to anyone who had not been changed in the same ways. I have thought about this bond many times across the years, because I think it is one of the more interesting and less discussed features of what happens to people in extreme circumstances. The literature on the plague, and there is a great deal of it, accounts and analyses and chronicles that accumulated in the decades after, tends to focus on the breakdown of social bonds, on the abandonment and the selfishness and the collapse of the conventions and obligations that normally hold communities together. And all of that happened. I witnessed all of it. I saw neighbors who had known each other for years refuse to cross the street for each other's benefit. I saw family members who would, under normal circumstances, have done anything for each other, find themselves unable to provide even the most basic forms of care out of a self-preservation that overrode every other loyalty. The breakdown of ordinary obligation was real and widespread, and in some cases devastating in its specific human consequences. But alongside this breakdown, and simultaneous with it, was a formation of the particular and intense bonds that I have described. These were not universal. They did not compensate for or cancel the breakdowns. But they were real, and they persisted, and the people formed by them were in many cases different kinds of people afterward. People with a specific quality of connection to each other that had been tested in ways ordinary connection is not tested and had proven itself durable in those conditions. The university continued its formal deliberations. I received reports from Arnaud periodically, and these reports charted the gradual retreat of official confidence from its initial certainty into something more carefully worded and less specific, the institutional equivalent of a man backing slowly toward the door while maintaining a composed expression. The astrological explanation became less prominent in the official communications. The miasma theory remained, because it at least provided a practical response. The burning of aromatic wood in the streets, the use of vinegar, the avoidance of certain atmospheric conditions, even if the practical response it provided was largely ineffective. This shift, from a specific explanation to a vaguer one, from a confident diagnosis to a more diffuse set of precautionary recommendations, was the institution doing what institutions do when their framework has been demonstrably insufficient, not abandoning the framework, but quietly widening it to absorb the evidence of failure. I watched this process with a complicated mix of frustration and sympathy that I could not entirely resolve. The frustration was professional. This was a medical crisis of extraordinary proportions, and the institution whose function it was to provide medical guidance was primarily engaged in protecting the coherence of its explanatory framework rather than confronting the insufficiency of that framework and building something better. The sympathy was personal. I recognized the process from my own interior experience, recognized the specific difficulty of the step that the institution was failing to take, and knew something about why the step was hard to take even when you could see clearly that it needed to be taken. It was in the winter of that first year that I met the village herbalist. I have described this encounter before and will not repeat every detail, but I want to linger a little longer than I have previously on what it meant to me. Not immediately, not in the days following the conversation, but gradually, across the months and years in which I had occasion to reflect on it. She had done something that I, with all my training, had not done. She had allowed her observations to be more authoritative than her pre-existing system of understanding. When the observations and the system conflicted, she had trusted the observations. This sounds simple. It is, in principle, simple. It is, in practice, for a person with a significant investment in a particular framework, for a person whose identity and professional standing and daily sense of coherent participation in a knowledge tradition are bound up in that framework. It is not simple at all. The framework I had been trained in was not simply a set of propositions about disease. It was a way of being a professional. It was the thing that made me a recognizable kind of person in a recognizable tradition. To step outside it, to say that what I observed contradicted what the tradition held, and that the observation took precedence, was not a neutral technical adjustment. It was an act that required a kind of intellectual courage I had not previously been asked to exercise, because I had not previously been in a situation where the framework was so plainly insufficient and the stakes of maintaining it were so directly deadly. The herbalist had never been inside the framework. She had nothing to protect. She could see clearly because there was nothing in the way. I began, slowly, across that winter, to see more clearly. Not as clearly as she had. The habits of 20 years of trained practice do not dissolve in a winter, and I would not claim that I arrived at the correct response with anything like her directness and confidence. But I began to let the observations lead more and the framework follow, rather than the reverse. I began to ask, more honestly and more often, whether what I was doing was working, and when the answer was no, to say so. To patients, to Henri, to myself. The saying so felt terrible at first, felt like a failure of professional obligation, like a betrayal of everything I had been formed to be. Then it felt more like honesty. Then it felt, eventually, more like the only responsible posture available. The second wave arrived in the autumn, and I will tell you what autumn was like in Montpellier in 1348. The smell of the city had changed. This is the thing I remember most viscerally from that period. Not the specific terrible events, not the deaths of specific people, though those were present and terrible. The smell of the city had acquired a quality that had not been there before and that I will not try to describe with precision, because precision in this case would produce an account that is both more clinical and less accurate than what I am trying to convey. The city smelled different. The air had a different texture when you breathed it. And this difference, subtle, always present, never quite identifiable as any specific thing, was the constant sensory reminder that something fundamental about the nature of the place had changed. The sounds had changed too, but more recognizably. The market was quieter, not silent. The market never went fully silent while the city was inhabited, but quieter, with a quality of reduced density, as if the same space was being produced with fewer instruments and the spaces between the sounds were more prominent. The bells rang for the dead with such frequency that they had ceased to be individual signals of individual deaths and had become simply a continuous low-level presence in the auditory background of daily life, like the river or the wind. You stopped registering specific rings as information and started registering the general quality of their presence as ambient context. This change, from specific to ambient, from signal to background, was itself a kind of information about the scale of what was happening, though you could not quite process it as information because the processing would have required a quality of emotional attention that was not available while the practical demands of daily function had to be met. There were particular silences that I found more difficult than the general quiet. The silence of Pierre's oven on the mornings after he became ill, the absence of the smell of baking bread that I had woken to every morning for 18 years, the specific and bounded absence of a specific and familiar thing, was in some ways harder to bear than the general emptiness of the streets. The general emptiness was so large as to be almost abstract. The absence of Pierre's bread was precisely the right size to be fully felt, small enough to be specific, large enough to represent the whole category of what was being lost. I noticed, on the first morning it was absent, that I had been relying on the smell of it in a way I had not previously understood, that it had been, in some functional sense, part of the beginning of my days, that its absence was therefore the absence of a component of something I had assumed would always be present, which is the hardest kind of absence to accommodate because it reveals, retrospectively, an assumption whose existence you had not previously acknowledged. Henri and I worked in these autumn weeks in a way that had changed from how we had worked before, not in the specific actions, which remained more or less the same, but in the quality of presence we brought to them. There was less conversation, not because conversation had become impossible or unwelcome, but because the things that might have been said were things that neither of us yet had the language for, and the silence between us was not the silence of distance, but the silence of two people who are in the same situation and know it and have agreed, without words, to simply continue to be in it together. We opened the shop. We prepared what we had. We attended what we were called to attend. We closed the shop. We ate in the evenings with less appetite than before. We slept, or tried to. And in the morning we opened the shop again, and the herbs smelled the same as they had always smelled, and outside the window the city made its changed and quieter sounds. And we were still there, and the work was still there, and that was what we had. I lost people I had known for many years. Pierre the baker died in October, and I am going to say a few things about Pierre beyond what I have already said, because he deserves more than a mention in passing. He was 61 years old. He had been making bread in the same oven, in the same building, across the lane from my shop, for more than 30 years. He had been established there when my teacher was still alive and practicing, and his bread had been part of the daily life of that block for longer than I had been in the city. He was a quiet man, the kind of man whose good character expressed itself not through dramatic acts, but through the consistent quality of his daily conduct, reliability, generosity in small ways, the particular gift for making the people around him feel that the space he occupied was slightly more hospitable than it would otherwise have been. His bread was good in the same way that he was good, without effort, without self-advertisement, simply and thoroughly and reliably. He died in his own house with his wife and his 2 surviving children present, which was not a given in those months. Many people died in conditions of isolation that added a specific kind of suffering to the physical dying. I attended at his bedside in the last days and could do little that was practically useful, but I was present, And I have believed since those years that presence has a value that is not reducible to the value of intervention, that the human fact of another person in the room, attending with genuine attention, is not nothing even when there is nothing else to offer. Arnaud died in November. I have said this before and I am going to say it again and spend a little more time with it, because Arnaud's death was one of the specific losses that changed the texture of my daily life in ways that continued to be felt for many years. We had known each other for nearly 15 years. We had consulted together on difficult cases more times than either of us had kept count of. His intellectual steadiness, the quality I have described as equanimity, the ability to maintain a clear and productive engagement with difficult problems without either dismissing their difficulty or being overwhelmed by it, had been a resource that I drew on more regularly than I had understood until it was no longer available. Without Arnaud, I was more professionally alone than I had been since I was a young man fresh in the city and still finding my footing, and this aloneness had a quality that the aloneness of youth does not have, the quality of having known what was absent, of knowing the specific shape of the gap. My wife became ill in April of 1349. I want to approach this carefully because it is the center of what I am telling you, and I do not want to approach it carelessly. I want to tell you the truth of it without turning it into something designed primarily to produce a particular effect in the listener, without the distortion that comes from shaping raw experience into narrative with too heavy a hand. She was ill for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, I did everything I was capable of doing, not only from my trained professional practice, but from everything I had learned in the preceding 2 years of working through this specific illness, everything I had observed that seemed to help, and that I had been using with some of my other patients with some evidence of benefit. I was not passive. I was not absent. I was not, in those weeks, primarily a grieving husband who had become incapable of professional function. I was a man trying very hard to keep his wife alive with every means available to him, which was the only thing I could properly be. She died anyway, on a Tuesday morning in early May, in the back room, with the light coming through the small window in the particular way that May morning light comes through east-facing windows in that part of the city, thin and golden and full of dust particles moving in the slow air. My children were in Cecile's care, and they survived, and I have held these two facts, the death of their mother and the survival of my children, in continuous close proximity for all the years since, because they belong together. They are two parts of the same event, and understanding the event requires understanding them together, requires sitting with both the loss and the continuation in the same moment, which is what the event itself required and what living with it afterward continues to require. I continued to work. I have explained why, and I will not repeat the explanation in full, but I want to add something to it that I may not have made sufficiently clear. The continuation of work in those months was not only the psychological mechanism I have described, the preservation of identity through the maintenance of function. It was also, as the months continued, the thing that kept me in contact with other people when the pull toward complete withdrawal was very strong. Every patient who came to the shop, every consultation I made, every conversation about a specific ailment that required a specific response, each of these was a thread connecting me to the human world in which I was still operating, pulling me back to the present tense when the pull toward the absence of the present tense was real and persistent and not always easy to resist. Henri was the other thread. He had become, in the years of the plague, someone I trusted in a way that exceeded the trust of a professional relationship, had become, in the compressed and accelerating way that extreme circumstances develop certain kinds of bonds, something more closely resembling a kinship. He had been present for things that I had been present for. He had seen what I had seen. He had lost what I had lost, his father, and then a long sequence of people who had inhabited the daily life we shared. And he continued to come to the shop in the mornings with the same steady quality he had brought to it since the beginning of his apprenticeship, unchanged in his reliability if changed in everything else. And this steadiness was, in those months, one of the more valuable things in my life. The summer of 1349 was strange in the particular way I described, the strange of subtraction rather than of addition, of the familiar rendered unfamiliar not by the introduction of new elements, but by the removal of existing ones. The streets had space in them where there had always been occupation. The buildings stood at their usual heights and in their usual configurations, but the life that had animated them was changed in its density and its composition. New people were beginning to arrive from elsewhere. drawn by the availability of housing and work in a city that had lost so much of its population. And these new people were both welcome and disorienting. Welcome because their presence meant that the city was not simply dying. Disorienting because their unfamiliarity underscored, by contrast, the familiarity of everything that had been lost. I watched the survivors with the attention of someone who is both observer and participant, who is trying to understand what is happening to other people partly because understanding is itself a resource in conditions of extremity, and partly because the people around me were undergoing the same processes I was undergoing, and their visible navigation of those processes was informative about my own. What I observed was not uniform. The range of human response to catastrophic loss is wide, and the plague had produced enough catastrophic loss that the full range was on continuous display. There were people who had found, in the wake of their losses, a kind of clarity about what mattered and what did not that manifested as a simplification of their daily preoccupations, a willingness to let go of status concerns and petty conflicts and the minor competitive anxieties of ordinary social life, in favor of a more direct engagement with the specific people and activities that seemed, from the vantage point of what they had been through, genuinely worth their attention. These people were, in my observation, among the more functional survivors, the ones who had processed enough of the experience to extract something of what it had to teach without being immobilized by it. There were people for whom the losses had produced the opposite effect, a desperate reinvestment in the ordinary social structures and hierarchies that the plague had disrupted, an attempt to reassemble the pre-plague world as closely as possible, to reoccupy the roles and relationships and habits as if the interruption could be simply overcome and the world returned to its prior state. This attempt was understandable. The desire for the familiar is powerful and legitimate, but it was not fully achievable because the world that these people were trying to reassemble did not quite exist anymore. The people who had inhabited its roles and relationships were in many cases gone. The structures themselves had shifted in ways that the desire to reoccupy them could not reverse. And there were people in whom the losses had produced a rage, not always directed at a specific object, not always manifested in obviously violent ways, but present as a quality of their engagement with the world, a bitterness that had set in the way that certain materials set when the conditions that would allow them to remain flexible are no longer present. These were the people who frightened me most, not because I judged them. I understood how they had arrived where they were, and the understanding precluded judgment, but because the bitterness they carried could not be discharged into anything useful, could only accumulate, and because I could see, in their condition, the outline of a possibility that was always present in my own. The persecution of the Jewish families in the lower quarter happened in those summer months, and I have already described it and will not describe it at length again except to say this. I did what I could, and it was not enough, and I have lived with this for all the years since. Not as a guilt that has remained fresh and acute, but as a settled fact about a period of my life in which the things I could do and the things that needed doing were not in adequate correspondence. I opposed what was happening in the ways available to me, in direct conversation with neighbors, and in whatever mild leverage I had from the respect that a long-established professional presence can generate. It was not enough. The logic of catastrophe, the logic that requires an agent when randomness is insupportable, is not well addressed by the individual opposition of a single apothecary speaking to his neighbors one conversation at a time. It required something larger, something institutional, and the institutions that might have provided it were themselves failing under the weight of what was happening. The flagellants came through in the late summer. I watched them with the complicated sympathy I have already described, and I want to add one thing to what I have already said about them, which is this. Their presence in the city was its own kind of information about the state of the available explanatory frameworks. When a large number of people respond to a crisis by subjecting themselves to physical suffering in public procession, what they are demonstrating is that the official explanations and official responses have failed to the point where unofficial and unorthodox responses seem more promising by comparison. The flagellants were not stupid people. They were not simply credulous people doing what they had been told. They were people for whom the official frameworks had visibly failed, who had concluded that something more drastic was required, and who had chosen the drastic response that their specific tradition made available. Understanding this does not require endorsing it, but failing to understand it, treating it as simply irrational behavior to be dismissed rather than as a legible response to a specific set of conditions, would be its own kind of failure. The plague subsided. I have said this, and I want to linger a moment on what subsiding meant in the specific, because the end of the plague was not, as accounts written at a distance from the experience tend to imply, a clear and definable moment of cessation. It was a process of gradual diminishment, punctuated by returns that were smaller than their predecessors, but which required the depleted city to muster resources it had reduced to small remainders. It was not possible, while it was happening, to know with confidence that it was happening, to know that the current reduction was not simply a pause before a return of equal or greater intensity. The end of the plague was something that could only be known from a distance, retrospectively, which meant that the people living through the later phases of it were doing so without the knowledge that it was ending, which is a different and in some ways more difficult psychological situation than the one the retrospective account implies. I married Elspeth in 1352, and I have described this marriage and do not want to repeat what I have already said except to note the specific quality of beginning something again, of choosing to make a life with another person, to expose oneself again to the specific vulnerability of attachment, in the full knowledge of what attachment costs when it is lost. This choice was not made easily or quickly. It was made after a period of careful internal examination that is perhaps the most serious deliberative process I have ever engaged in, more serious even than the professional deliberations of the plague years. Because those deliberations, however consequential, were about what to do in circumstances imposed on me from outside. This was about what to choose, what kind of life to inhabit going forward, what risks to continue accepting, what kind of person I wanted to be in the decades that remained. I chose connection. I chose the full vulnerability of genuine attachment. Not because I had forgotten the cost. I had not forgotten, and I think I never will. But because I had arrived, through the plague years and the years following them, at a position from which I could see clearly what the alternative would cost. The person who protects himself from loss by refusing attachment is protected, in a narrow sense. But what he is protected inside is something that has ceased to be fully alive in the ways that make the protection worth having. I had watched people make that choice in the years after the plague, and I had watched what it produced, and I did not want what it produced. Elspeth was a woman of considerable practical competence and a certain directness of expression that I found, after the careful dancing around of hard subjects that the plague years had required, genuinely refreshing. She said what she thought. She did what she said she would do. She brought her 2 children into our household with an organized thoughtfulness that I admired, attending to the complicated social and emotional logistics of blended households with more patience and skill than I could have managed. We made a life together that was different from the life I had made with my first wife, different in its specific texture, its rhythms, its particular combination of pleasures and difficulties, but genuine and inhabited fully by both of us, which is what a life between 2 people requires, and not everyone in those years had the reserves left to provide. She died in 1358, as I have said, of a fever that progressed through its expected stages and was grieved in the expected way. I sat with this grief and let it do what grief does when it is not prevented from doing it. Move through its stages, change its character across the months, become something that is present without being overwhelming, then something that is present without being painful, then something that has been incorporated into the fabric of daily life as a weight that is carried rather than a wound that is tended. This is what grief is permitted to become under the right conditions. The grief of the plague years was not permitted to become this, because the conditions required for its natural progression were not present. The plague did not stop arriving long enough for the grief to move through its phases before the next loss required a new allocation of the grief that was available. My children grew into adults in the changed city, shaped by it in ways that became clearer to me as the years advanced, and I had more perspective from which to observe them. My son brought to the apothecary practice the empirical directness I have described, the willingness to let observation lead, and to say plainly when observation contradicted received authority. He had not been formed by the old certainties and did not feel the pull to protect them. He moved through the practice with a freedom of inquiry that I had had to work to achieve, and that seemed, in him, simply natural. The default orientation of a person who had grown up in a world where the insufficiency of established frameworks had been demonstrated at an unforgettable scale. I found myself, across those later years, occupying the role of neighborhood memory, the person who held, in their specific and personal recollection, the record of who had been where and what it had looked like when it was fully inhabited. People came to ask me questions about the before, and I tried to answer them honestly. Not sentimentalizing, not making the before into something it was not, but giving as accurate an account as memory and honesty could together produce of what the world had been like in the specific before that the questioner was asking about. This role was not one I sought. It was one that was given to me by the arithmetic of survival. I was among the older inhabitants, the ones who had been present across the full range of the change, and that presence had a value to people trying to understand the place they lived in. I wrote things down. I have mentioned this before, and I want to say something more comprehensive about it, because the writing has been not merely a record-keeping activity, but something more fundamental to how I have processed the experience of these years. Writing requires organization. It requires the imposition of a sequence on events that, at the level of lived experience, arrive simultaneously and chaotically. It requires the selection of what is significant from the enormous mass of what occurred. It requires the construction of a language adequate to the experience, which is often more difficult than the selection, because experience, particularly extreme experience, frequently exceeds the capacity of available language to contain it without distortion. I have been inadequate to the experience many times in the writing. I have found the language failing or finding it and discovering that what I have found is a simplified or dramatized version of what actually happened, which has a narrative tidiness that the actual experience lacked. I have revised and rewritten and concluded that the revision is itself another simplification. This is, I have come to believe, not a failure specific to my writing or my intelligence, but a feature of the general relationship between extreme experience and the language available to describe it. The experience is always larger than the language. The honest writer acknowledges this, continues anyway, and holds the acknowledgement in mind while reading what they have written. But I have also found, in the writing, something that surprised me and that I did not anticipate when I began, a kind of company. The written account is a fixed form of a presence. It exists independently of the moment of its production, can be returned to, can be added to, can be read in conditions different from those of its writing. In keeping a written account, I have been in continuous relationship with the events it describes, not in the way that memory keeps a relationship, which is to say, in the involuntary and sometimes unwelcome form of intrusive recollection, but in the chosen, purposeful, structured form that writing produces. This relationship has been useful to me. It has been a way of continuing to be present with what I have lived through without being passive in that presence, without simply being visited. It is late in the evening now, later than it usually is when I settle into this chair and let the day complete its transition into night. The fire has been doing what fires do for the last hour, reducing itself through its stages toward the coals that will hold their warmth through the small hours and be present, still warm, when morning asks to be built again from them. The herbs on the shelf across the room smell the way they have always smelled. Rosemary most prominently tonight. That clean, slightly sharp, deeply familiar scent that is the smell of my whole professional life distilled into a single perception. The mortar is in its place. The jars are in their places. The room is the room it has been for all the years of my practice, changed in the surface ways that rooms change with use and time and the replacement of one set of furnishings with another, unchanged in the fundamental ways that rooms charged with long habitation are not changed by time, but only deepened in their quality of place. Outside, the city is settling into night in the way it always does, the sounds of the working day giving way to the quieter sounds of the inhabited evening. Voices in the streets diminishing, the cart wheels stilling, the particular quality of sound that a city generates after dark when the commerce has concluded, and what remains is the residential life. I have heard this transition thousands of times. I hear it tonight with the specific attention that familiarity, when it has been threatened and restored, gives to things that were previously taken for granted. The sounds of the city at night are not taken for granted by me. They have not been taken for granted since the years when they were absent, when the streets held only the silence that is the sound of a city from which a great deal of life has been removed. I want to say something, before I finish, about what I think these years taught me, because I am old enough that the question of what the years taught me is not an abstract one, but a practical one. A question about what I carry and what I have set down and what I will leave behind when I go. I do not intend this as a systematic account. I am not, at this point in my life, interested in systematic accounts. I am interested in the specific and the honest, in the particular rather than the general. I have learned that knowledge is not protection. This was the most difficult lesson and the most important one, and the one that cost the most to learn, because I had built my life on the assumption that knowledge was protection, that the sufficient accumulation of understanding about how the world worked would constitute a defense against the ways the world could hurt you. This is not true. Knowledge is useful. It is genuinely, meaningfully useful. I am not arguing against learning or against the effort to understand. But it is not protection. The world does not make agreements with the learned. The plague did not consult the medical faculty before arriving. I have learned that the ordinary is precious in a way that is invisible until its precariousness becomes apparent. I have said this before in this account, and I say it again because I think it is the most transferable thing I know. Transferable in the sense of being applicable to lives that are not mine, to circumstances that are not the circumstances of the plague years. The ordinary evening, the adequate wine and the excellent bread, the familiar voice, the fire settling into coals. These are not the backdrop of a life. They are its substance. They are what we are given, most of us, most of the time, and the gift is not adequately perceived until the possibility of its loss, or the loss itself, gives us eyes to see it properly. I have learned that institutions are not the primary resource in a crisis of sufficient magnitude. The institutions that organized my world, the church, the university, the guild structures, the feudal arrangements, all of them showed, under the pressure of the plague, the specific ways in which they were insufficient. This insufficiency was not, in most cases, the result of bad faith or deliberate failure. It was the result of the fact that institutions are organized to address the range of problems they have previously encountered, and when a problem falls outside that range, the institutional response is to expand the range of what the institution can address while maintaining the institution's fundamental structure, rather than to abandon the structure in favor of a direct response to the new problem. This is almost always the wrong response to a crisis of sufficient novelty, and it is almost always the response that institutions produce. And knowing this is not a counsel of despair about institutions, but a counsel of appropriate expectations and supplementary preparation. I have learned that people are capable of extraordinary things in both directions simultaneously. The cruelty and the compassion of those years were not sequential, not the cruelty followed by the compassion, or the compassion followed by the cruelty, but simultaneous, happening in the same places at the same times among the same people, each an authentic expression of the range that human nature contains and can express when the conditions are sufficiently extreme. I do not find this either surprising or deeply troubling. I find it honest. I find it a more accurate picture of human nature than the ones that simplify in either direction, that reduce people to either their nobility or their failure. People are large enough to contain both, and the conditions of the plague years were clarifying enough to make the containing visible. I have learned that the act of recording, of writing things down, of giving the specifics of experience a fixed form and language, is not merely an intellectual exercise or a professional habit, but something closer to a survival mechanism of a particular and essential kind. We are creatures who require narrative the way we require air. Not the same kind of requirement, not the same urgency, but the same fundamentalness. We cannot live well in unorganized experience. We need the sequence, the connection between what happened and what came from it, the location of the self within a story that has a beginning and a middle and some possibility of continuation. Writing is one of the ways that story is made and held, and in the years when every other organizing structure was failing, the private act of writing down what I had seen was the act of maintaining, in the only form available, the narrative coherence that the situation otherwise made impossible. This was not heroism. It was need. But it was also, as it turned out, something I am glad to have done, glad to be leaving behind, glad to offer to whatever future reader finds their way to it. And I have learned. This is the last thing, and perhaps the most important one, though in a different register from the others, that continuation is not a small achievement. That to keep going, to keep opening the shop in the morning and grinding the herbs and attending to the work that is available and being present to the people in your daily life and noticing the quality of light and the smell of rosemary and the sound of the city settling into night. That this is not a lesser achievement than the dramatic ones, not a consolation prize for those who lack the capacity for something more magnificent. It is, in its own way, the hardest thing and the most necessary thing. It is what the living owe each other and owe themselves. It is what I have tried to do across all the years since the worst of it, with the best of my ability and the specific imperfection of a particular person who survived something large and was changed by it, and continued anyway. The fire is very low now. The coals will hold through the night. The city outside has gone to its evening quiet, and in a little while I will go to mine, and the morning will come as mornings do, in the specific way that mornings in this city come, with the sounds of the market beginning before the light, with the smell of bread baking across the lane from the new baker who learned the trade from Pierre's widow and who has never known that the smell of his bread is, for me, a layered thing, carrying within it both the pleasure of the present and the memory of everything the present has replaced. He does not need to know this. It is enough that he bakes well, and that the smell drifts across the lane in the cold mornings the way it always has, and that I am still here to notice it. My children come to see me with some regularity. My daughter brings her own children, my grandchildren, 3 of them now, the eldest approaching the age I was when the plague arrived, and looking at me sometimes with a curiosity that I recognize as the curiosity of someone who has heard fragments of a history and wants to understand the whole of it. I tell them what I can, at the level that seems appropriate for their ages and for the particular question that the particular child is asking. I do not spare them the truth of it. I have learned that sparing people the truth of difficult things does them no lasting service and ultimately produces a kind of ignorance that leaves them less prepared for their own inevitable encounters with the ways the world can be, but I give it to them in the quantities they can receive at the stage they are at. The truth about difficult things is best given gradually, in increments the recipient can process, rather than all at once in a form that overwhelms rather than illuminates. My son tends the shop with the thorough and empirically minded competence I have described, and has added to it certain improvements of his own devising that I have found, in most cases, genuinely better than what they replaced. This is as it should be. The practice exists not to preserve the specific forms I received it in, but to do what it has always done, to be useful, to address what the people who come to it actually need, to improve whenever improvement is available and honest about limitation when it is not. He has improved it. I am glad of this. The thing I spent my working life in is in better hands than mine, doing better work than I was able to do, and the specific pride I take in this is different from, but not lesser than the pride I took in my own work. It is, perhaps, a more settled pride, less tied to the ego's investment in personal performance, more genuinely oriented toward the thing itself and its continuation. I find, sitting here in the last of the firelight, that I am not restless. This is worth noting because I remember times when I was very restless. The restlessness of the plague years, which was the restlessness of someone who cannot settle because settling feels like capitulation to a situation that demands resistance, and the restlessness of the years immediately following, which was the restlessness of someone moving through a landscape so changed from what they had expected that they cannot quite trust their footing even on ground that appears solid. Those forms of restlessness are gone. What has replaced them is not complacency. I am not complacent about much. It is not a temperamental tendency I have ever been inclined toward, but something more like the settled quality that comes from having arrived, after a long journey by a complicated route, at the place where you were always going to end up. Not a destination I chose or planned for, but a destination that is recognizably mine, that fits the specific shape of the life I have lived, that I inhabit with the ease of a space that has been designed, by all the years of living, for exactly the person I have become. I think of the people I have named in this account, and the many more I have not named, the patients who came through the door of the shop over 50 years of practice, each one bringing with them the particular specificity of their ailment, and their fear, and their hope, and their specific life as it had been arranged up to the point of their arrival at my counter. Some I helped, some I could not help, some I think about still. The ones where the question of whether I did enough or chose correctly remains alive, remains worth asking even when the asking produces no final answer. This is as it should be. The cases that were easy do not require continuing examination. The ones that were hard, the ones where the limits of what I could do were in direct contact with the urgency of what needed doing. These are the ones that a conscientious person continues to turn over, not from guilt exactly, but from the ongoing commitment to understanding that conscientious practice requires. I am at peace with what I was and what I did, and what I was not, and what I could not do. This peace did not come all at once, and was not easily achieved, and did not arrive until I had spent sufficient time in the honest examination of the record, written and interior, to have identified, as clearly as my capacity for honest self-assessment allows, what deserved to be regretted and what did not, what was failure and what was simply the limit of the possible, what was my specific fault, and what was the fault of circumstance or knowledge, or the sheer magnitude of what was being asked. This examination is never complete, but it is sufficiently advanced that what remains is not torment, but the mild and workable form of ongoing moral attention that I think a person of genuine conscience carries for the entirety of their life and would not want to set down even if they could. Rest now, if you are listening to this in the way I hope you are listening, lying somewhere comfortable, letting the words move through you like water through a familiar channel, not requiring anything of you except the willingness to receive them. The night is long and entirely safe. The things that needed doing today were done, or will be done tomorrow, which is soon enough. There is nothing between you and the morning except the good darkness and the sound of your own breathing, and whatever it is that the mind does in the hours when it releases its grip on the management of the waking day and lets itself sink into the deeper thing. I am still here, at the window, in the last of the firelight. The river is there in the distance, doing what the river does, flowing forward without consulting the past, without accounting for what happened on its banks, moving with the specific and inexhaustible patience of things that do not have the burden of memory. I have always found this comforting rather than cold. The river was here before me and will be here after me and carries, in its continuous movement, something that is not meaning but is better than meaninglessness. It is simply continuation, simply the flowing forward of what is. I have been flowing forward for a long time now. I expect to continue for some time more. And then, whenever the time comes that I do not continue, these words will remain. This record of a particular person in a particular place during a particular set of events that changed the world I inhabited and changed me along with it, told as honestly as I am able to tell it, offered to whoever wants to receive it, set down without requirement that it be received in any specific way or that it produce any specific effect. Take from it what you find useful, leave what you do not, and sleep well, if sleep is what you came here for. It is, I think, a good place to let the story rest. Here, at the window, in the last of the light, with the city breathing outside and the river somewhere in the dark beyond it, and the morning, as always, preparing itself in the east. That is enough. It has always been enough. It is enough tonight.